Yeah, woo!
You guys on our.
Woo! Okay, so I was asked to talk about, and the way that the scientists associated with C2R2 called this, they kept saying, talk about Civics 101, and I was like, I don't know what that is. So I'm calling it Civics 101, but it's a conversation, which means if I'm up here doing the talking head thing, I'm gonna get upset and I'm gonna start calling on you guys, and I'm gonna start with Russell and Tracy. So, and when I was thinking about Civics 101, I was stressing about this presentation, and now I think about this, like a dozen of you, so why was I stressing? But it's like, Civics 101, what is that? Is it politics? Is it civics? Is it policy? Is it government? Like, I don't know what that is. And if you talk to any of my friends who are policy geeks like me, they're like, oh my God, we're so sick of hearing Jeanne talk about that presentation she's gonna give because she keeps like belly aching about it. And so it was actually in class last week when Elena said, it'd be nice to know how policy is made. So that's what I'm gonna kind of focus on in this talk, the concept of how is policy made? And we've got policy students in the room, so they will keep me honest, I hope. It's hard to talk about this kind of topic and keep it jazzy. So throughout the presentation, I've just put up random cute pictures to keep you awake. And we're starting with Tilly the Wonder Dog, my 15-year-old Chihuahua Bichon poodle who's blind, can't hear, and has 4 teeth. So, so this will keep you going. So there's Miss Tilly. So someone else today said I should sing that, you know, How Bill Becomes a Law song, but I'm not gonna do that. But I just wanna make sure we're all on the same page, because Carrie keeps saying to me that you guys, I know you guys are steeped in the sciences, and so some of this might be not necessarily how you think about the world. To me, I'm assuming you're on the same page on this, right? That there's a United States Constitution, right? Tell me if you're not on this page. No, I'm serious, I'm serious. I don't have to go into this. There's a constitution, it's the governing body of the land. There are 3 branches of government, right? Yes, good, okay. And that also corresponds to the state level. There's a state constitution, there are 3 branches of government at the state level. There's clear jurisdiction about what happens in each branch of government, the legislative branch, right? The executive branch, the judicial branch. And there's often conflict about who can do what, right? So is it the federal government? Is it the state government? A lot of times you hear about states' rights. You know, what is it that states should be doing? And clearly we see that in the debate about gay marriage, that the courts have ruled that that's the jurisdiction of the states and not the federal government. But that's a constant area of tension. The other one that I'll refer to later on is the concept of interfering with commerce. So commerce is for example, is in the jurisdiction of the federal government because we are, in fact, one large country made up of many states, and that states can't block commerce from one state to another. So that's just kind of an example of what remains at the federal level, whereas something like gay marriage stays at the state level. And then we'll talk a little bit about municipal level too. Is this what you guys were hoping for? Carrie, is this what you guys were hoping for? Elaine, is this what you were hoping for?
Yes.
All right, phew. All right, so, and then, because my background is I've done a lot of policy work in New Jersey, although I've advised federal agencies, and I have sat on 2 local boards, 1 elected. I'm talking to you about my experiences. So a lot of the examples you're gonna see here are from areas of work that I've done, so speak what you know. So the examples will be things that I'm familiar with. So one thing I'll talk about a lot is when I talk about state policy, it's going to be using New Jersey as the example, because that's what I know. And so one question you'll have is, so what's the deal, like I'm talking about municipalities here, but what's the deal with regions and counties? And the answer to that question is it's different in different states. So in New Jersey, there are 2 statutorily established regional bodies, the Highlands and the Pinelands. And the statutes that establish those regional bodies give them certain authorities to do certain things that I'm not going to go into now. In New Jersey, the municipalities have a lot of authority, whereas the counties don't. But if you go to a state like Maryland, that's where the counties have authority and the states don't. I'm going to just keep going until someone says I need something else, all right? Okay, so we're all on the same page. The other reason I was thinking about this whole thing about like how's policy made, when you just Google like how is policy made, you get these nice, neat, tidy diagrams, So someone has an idea and they go to the Congress or to the legislature, there's a vote, there's a debate, and then it becomes a law, and hooray, it's beautiful, it's all done. When in fact, because all of you have taken the class that Lisa and I teach, we know that policy making and we know that decision making is influenced by lots of factors. So let's remind ourselves of what they are. Tracy and Russell. Come on, what are some of the factors that go into decision making? It's like class number 3. Thank you, Zoe. Money. What else? You've talked to lots of decision makers in our class. What else do they think about? Personal values, yeah.
Different types of populations?
Yes, vulnerable populations included. What else? I'm sorry. Resources, yep. The acoustics in this room are terrible, and I'm talking loud because I have really bad allergies, so I'm not hearing great. So some of the things I was thinking about is cost benefit, cost effectiveness, equity, people, availability of resources to implement the policy, conflicting priorities, the technological availability. You might have a great idea, but there's no way to actually do the great idea. There's just no technology to do it. Small p politics. When I say small p, I mean not necessarily Democratic or Republican, just more that there's different interest parties who want different things, and what is politically palatable, what can the public tolerate is something that decision makers consider, and of course, oh golly, science. So we know that policy making is not nice and tidy, as you learned in 4th grade. And then there's always, the whole issue of of politics, and so some of the things that we'll talk about is something, is it really policy or is it politics or is it both? It's hard to know. And if you want to be sort of, I guess, negative, you can characterize anything as sort of politics, but I would argue that that's just part of the process. So up on the upper left-hand side is the definition of policy, and you're going to see if you're doing this a lot, on and off, which defines policy as the means by which government maintains order, addresses the needs of citizens, right? So policy is how do we actually implement the ideas that have been developed. Up on the upper right is civics. So civics is what do we all as citizens? What is it to be a responsible citizen, and what's our role in the process? And then the definition of politics is the actual art or science of governing, probably more art than science, would be my guess. And then if you want to think about the nexus between policy and politics, then you can start to think about it that way, but they're definitely kind of meshed together, right? So with policy, we're bringing in values, we're bringing in science, we're bringing in lots of points of view, and politics really is looking at the needs or the jostling, the elbowing of different parties involved. So for this conversation, in terms of how is policy made 101, I'm going to talk about it from how I look at it. And this probably does not meet any textbook. It's just based on my experience working with federal policymakers, state policymakers, and being on local bodies. So the folks who understand it by textbook that's when they'll chime in and tell me I'm wrong. And I'm thinking about it in terms of laws. I'm thinking about it in terms of the rules and regulations that are used to implement laws, both in terms of what's the content of the rules and regulations, and the process by which those rules and regulations are developed. So this is the slide that's organizing the rest of my talk, right? So frame the talk, I'm framing my talk. Executive policies, so how in the executive branch decisions are made, and in particular I'll talk about executive orders and general powers of executive agencies. Case law, of course, and the process by which laws and rules are actually implemented, which I would argue the implementation and how they're implemented is a policy in itself, which includes how they're funded. And then referendum, which is not relevant in New Jersey. But, all right, so with that, we need a little more cute. All right. Everyone's, I know, right? Oh, is the question about the cute picture?
Referendum is not relevant in New Jersey.
Oh, because New Jersey doesn't have a referendum law. So like well, we'll talk about it, but in other states you can actually petition. So when you hear about proposition something or other in California, there's actual authority to be able to petition, for a citizen to be able to petition. Okay, so I'm gonna start by talking about the intersection of state and federal laws. Is this interesting? Isn't this great? Right, this is good, right? Okay, so, and this is a really awkward setup, right? Because it's up there and I'm here, I'll do my best. And what I'm going to use as my example is the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, which was passed in 1972. Do you guys have familiarity with that act? A little bit? Some? Okay. It's a really, really interesting law for a lot of reasons. And Zoe probably knows a lot about it because she's helping to implement it now in this state. So it's intended to provide protections for the countries, the coasts and the Great Lakes. And it has three major components. Right? So it establishes the estuarine research reserves, right? So you all have been or will be going down to J.C. Neer, right? So one of our estuarine research reserves. It provides grants to states, so it passes through to states the ability to be able to undertake coastal projects, particularly projects that involve restoration of natural resources. And then it creates a framework for states to implement coastal policies which then bind the federal government to abide by state policies. So it's a very interesting way that it's set up. So if a state, so there's only 30 states, I think, that have chosen to participate in the National Coastal Zone Management Program. And what that means is that the state the state legislature passes its own law authorizing participation, and then the state executive branch implements a set of policies that it can use for implementation of its program. When the state does that, when the state says, it's the policy of the state of New Jersey that within our coast we're going to do X, Y, and Z, then if the federal government is going to make decisions outside of state waters, I'm sorry, I didn't mention that, right? So the Coastal Zone Management Act establishes where state waters are. So in New Jersey, it's 3 miles out, right? Okay, so in New Jersey, it's 3 miles out. And then after 3 miles, it's federal waters. So if the federal government under the Coastal Zone Management Act is going to make a decision outside of state waters, and that state participates in the Coastal Zone Management Program, then the state gets to be able to determine whether the federal government's decision is consistent with state policy. So it's called federal consistency. So if the federal government is going to lease a wind area off of the Jersey coast and it's outside of 3 miles, New Jersey's got a say in that. So that's why Coastal Zone Management Law is very unique in its design, but important because it allows the state to control what happens in its own waters, but it also allows the state to have a say in what happens in federal waters. Yes, hooray, a question. That's a good question. Well, for one is you got to get it through your legislature, and that's not necessarily easy, right? I mean, there's certainly some interests that don't support proactive planning because they feel that it's controlling, and they much prefer more of a laissez-faire approach. I think it's what's politically palatable in any given state, but it's a good question. So one of the other things that the Coastal Zone Management Law does is, under the 309 program, it provides resources and sort of technical assistance to states to undertake specific programs, like increasing public access to coastal resources, or doing things to enhance wetlands. So if a state that's participating in the program wants to increase public access to cultural resources or to coastal resources, the federal government come in and help the state to provide technical assistance on how to do that. So if you look at handout number 1, this provides you with the findings from the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. And what it does, all I copied for you are the actual findings, and then on the second page is the declaration of policy. So what the findings do, and in any law, whether it's state or federal, there's a statement of findings. So it's what the governing body, what the Congress people or state legislators were thinking. It articulates their purpose for passing this piece of legislation. And I'll tell you why it's important in a minute, because it kind of comes across as a little blah, 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 but it can actually be incredibly important. So what the Coastal Zone Management Act does is it lays out this very eloquent language about the importance of coastal resources and the value that they bring in terms of natural resources, but economic development, maritime resources, but it really speaks a lot to the natural value of coastal resources. And then on the second page, you'll see, in this case, Congress actually said in passing the Coastal Zone Management Act, it is the policy of the land. It is our policy, our country's policy, to preserve, protect, and where possible, restore or enhance the resources in the coastal zone. So this language all becomes important in helping a state to be consistent with that. So a state's policies need to be consistent with that lofty language, or they won't get approved to participate in the federal program. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about policy and politics. So about a week ago, Governor Murphy signed a New Jersey state law that said that New Jersey will not allow oil and gas drilling within New Jersey's coastal zone, within New Jersey's 3 miles, right? And then the other thing that the law said is it said that in federal waters, right? Because New Jersey can't control the federal waters. Those are federal waters. We can only control what happens in the 3 miles. In the federal waters, it said, and if there's a project out there in federal waters and they need to then, connect and have infrastructure on the land to be able to bring that gas or oil in, then New Jersey won't allow it because we can control what's happening on our coast. So I guess my question for you is that policy or is that politics? Because you could argue that it's politics because Governor Murphy would have the opportunity to make the decision about what happens in 3 miles anyhow. Did he really need the belt and suspenders of an additional law? And could also do the same in terms of whatever's connected. Is it policy or is it politics? Because just a couple weeks earlier, the federal government started to say, well, we're kind of expecting that we're going to carve New Jersey out of our policy on oil and gas, and we don't think we're actually going to do that in New Jersey anyhow, just like we carved out Florida. So, I guess I would argue it's policy because policy, in addition to taking action, part of policy is also setting a tone. And so in the governor doing this, it kind of sets a tone for one, it takes off the gloves in terms of the federal government, but it also sort of sets a tone in terms of helping executive agencies to understand, to think about how this governor is going to look at the coast.
Where do federal waters begin?
After 3 miles in New Jersey. Okay, so now let's extend this a little bit further, and we're going to talk about the national ocean policy. So for many years in the 90s, there were a lot of people doing research, and there were 2 blue ribbon commissions looking at how do we protect the country's oceans and the country's coastal resources. And both of those blue ribbon panels made very extensive recommendations. So in 2010, President Obama signed a national executive order which established what is referred to as a national ocean policy that included some very specific recommendations for how the federal government would be controlling and what the policies for the federal government would be in terms of the national ocean policy. Now, if you read an executive order, I mean, the language kind of comes across as very lofty, and you could kind of say, you know, oh, pish posh, this actually doesn't have any kind of real meaning. But it often does. And in this case, the National Ocean Policy included an appendix, and that's your handout number 2. I only copied the first couple pages, so the document that's here is the full version of it, just to give you kind of a flavor. So in this case, there's a National Ocean Policy that lays out lofty goals about preserving coastal resources of our country. But then what it has is an appendix that lays out how the federal government is going to go about doing that. And it lays out some fairly specific action items for work that's going to be moving forward. And one of the big parts of this initiative is where the executive order actually lays out priorities. So this is the president's way to say to his executive agencies, and for him to say to states that participate in the Coastal Zone Management Program, right? So now he's saying to 30 states, these are the priorities that we're going to all focus on in terms of where we implement programs like this, where we spend money, where we sue people, whatever it is that the work of government. And so the one I'll focus on is the one that promotes the development of coastal and marine spatial planning. So the idea that within the coastal zone, the ocean is a very busy place, right? We have underwater cables, we have recreational uses and fishing and recreational fishing and commercial fishing, and we have birders, and we have wind turbines, and we have offshore drilling. So there's a lot going on in the ocean. And so what the National Ocean Policy calls for and lays out a framework for is the ability for federal agencies to come together and look at those potential conflicts to try to work out ways in which those conflicts can be addressed. And so part of what the follow-up from the National Ocean Policy was the creation within different regions in the country planning bodies. So there's a Mid-Atlantic planning body, which includes the 5 states in the Mid-Atlantic. The Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean which is a state group, works closely with the Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body. And this is the Ocean Action Plan that the Mid-Atlantic group just issued two years ago. And what that does is it lays out partnership opportunities between federal agencies and state agencies. And so it talks about things like we're going to work together to identify where in the Mid-Atlantic we can site offshore wind and not disturb other important coastal resources, whether that's fisheries or marine mammals or maritime resources. So this becomes the policy not just of the United States, but of the Mid-Atlantic region and of the states, the 5 states in the Mid-Atlantic region that have agreed to work together. The other very practical part of this is that the Ocean Plan lays out interjurisdictional coordination, right? So the other thing that policymakers like to do is they like to put acronyms and everything, right? So in the art, these are IJCs. So now you've got the states that are coming together to say, let's work on IJCs together. What's a good IJC to work on? Let's look at where, we might have a conflict in my state with being able to move cargo, from the port of Baltimore, up maybe to Boston, and maybe that conflicts with something in another state. So that states are working together to do this. The federal government is providing technical assistance. The federal government's providing resources to help the states do this. They're having federal agencies sit at the table. So that is sort of the implementation of the policy. Now, that all sounds fantastic, right? Like, who can disagree with that? Who could possibly disagree with coordination, right? So it seems like mom and apple pie to me. Who could disagree, right? But no, not so much. So what your third handout shows you is after President Obama issued the executive order, in this case, it came from the Republican leadership in the Natural Resource Committee, where they, and then also handout number 4, what they talked about was that the president implemented the executive order without any authority, without any background, any basis for his policy. So they're essentially accusing him of implementing policy without the authority to do so. Typically, an executive order starts like this. It says, based on the powers given to me by the whatever, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Deep Water Ports Act, it names the specific statute, and it lays out the argument for what that authority is. In this case, for the National Ocean Policy Executive Order, the president's language was, based on the powers and the authorities of the United States of America, I'm doing this. I'm going to develop my national ocean policy. And so you have the Republicans in Congress saying, no, you did not even demonstrate at all where this authority comes from. There has not been a lawsuit in terms of whether there was any kind of constitutional or specific authority in some law somewhere for the president to do this, probably in large part because any day now, everyone's expecting the national ocean policy to be rescinded by the current president, right? So now we've talked about federal policy, we've talked about state policy, and we've talked about executive policy, right? So this is where a policy maker, in this case the president, is implementing his policy essentially based on his interpretation of the laws. In this case, he didn't even name the laws, though. So further on ocean planning, on the concept of ocean planning, and so now we know that the states are all kind of working together on ocean planning. So about a year ago, New York State came out with its plan, which is a state that participates in the Coastal Zone Management Program. So New York State came out with its plan for where it wants to work with the federal government for offshore wind leases. And what New York State said that it did was it conducted all these research studies, it engaged stakeholders to really think about what are the potential conflicts in those waters for where New York State might want to be able to work with the federal government to lease offshore wind farms. And that all sounds great, but when you start to look to see what New York State is proposing for its lease areas, what do you notice? Right, what about New Jersey? So because these are in federal waters, right, New York State is proposing them. Essentially what New York State is doing is it's petitioning the federal government saying, we think you should put the wind turbines here. And it's the policy of the state of New York to try to have more renewable energy. And this is exactly where we think it can come from. The problem is that when they met with all those stakeholders, they didn't think to include New Jersey fishermen, fishers, because these areas, the southern areas, is a very rich area for fishing, ground fishing, for New Jersey fishermen, fisher people. It's also an area that is prime for the transport of some goods from the port in Philadelphia up to Boston, which is an important source of revenue for New Jersey, for port operators. Now the question is, how will New Jersey exert its policy, right? So it's a little bit of a conflicting policy because we've got a governor who just pushed to have a piece of legislation passed in New Jersey to move towards having 50% of our energy come from renewable resources. But now he's in a little bit of a pickle because he's got the fishermen telling them that this is gonna really, really affect their livelihood. So the question then becomes, in terms of a policy perspective for New Jersey now, is are they going to file a federal consistency statement opposing what New York is proposing in terms of New York's suggested areas for offshore wind leases? Does this make sense? Okay. So is it policy, is it politics? I don't know, or maybe it's just not good participatory processes, right? So I don't know about you guys, but I need a cute fix, right? So we get a little cute in there, right? Isn't that one cute? Oh my God, it's just horrible. All right, so now what I want to talk about a little bit is the implementation of laws and the implementation of rules. So rules and regulations are the processes that government uses to implement a law, right? So if you're the legislature or you're the Congress, you're going to pass a law that says it's the policy of the United States or the policy of the state of New Jersey that we want to be able to make sure that industrial facilities don't release chemicals into the environment. And so because of that, industrial facilities have to report to the state of New Jersey what kind of chemicals they use. So that's kind of how the law is worded. The rules and regulations that the executive agencies then use to implement that law is much more specific. So it'll say, these are the facilities that are covered under this law. This is the form that you have to report your hazardous materials on. This is the date by which you will report it. This is the place which you will send it. These are the penalties that we will impose upon you if you don't do it. So the rules and regs are just as important in terms of policy making as the law because they interpret the law. And there, that's important, interprets the law. And in interpreting the law, the rules and regs themselves set policy. So the legislature or the Congress sets policy, the executive leader, the governor, or the president by an executive order can set policy, and then the executive agencies, so NOAA, or the EPA, or the State Department of Environmental Protection, or the State Department of Transportation, in their rulemaking, they also set policy. And a couple examples are, so New Jersey used to participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Everyone knows what that is, the cap and trade program for CO2 for power plants. New Jersey pulled out. But when New Jersey was first entering the program, the law says, not the regulations, the law says when that cap is set and the state brings in revenue, 10% of the revenues each year goes to forest stewardship and to enhancement of tidal marshes, because those natural resources sequester and absorb carbon. So this is one way for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So now it's the executive agency, the State Department of Environmental Protection's turn to implement that law and implement that language. And so the conundrum, and many hours with lawyers in rooms, went about, is it a capital S or a lowercase s? Because if it's a lowercase s, then we're talking about $7 million a year that come in as the source of revenue going into enhancing forests all around the state. as opposed to a capital S, which means the state's owned forests. So the various forests around the state that are owned by the state. So that is an interpretation, right? That's like, but it's a big deal. It's $7 million a year for where does it go? Another interpretation is the famous Helix decision. Most of you last year or this year got a chance to meet John Weingart, right, who you think of as the Eagleton Institute. But he used to run the State Coastal Management Program. And this is the Helix as you're coming out of the Lincoln Tunnel, right? You've all come out of Lincoln Tunnel to New Jersey. I grew up just about a mile north of that Helix. And so there was a permit to build a really big building, sort of where the ones are there now. Pretend they weren't there, because that's what it used to look like. And I keep stepping in front of you, Sean.
It's okay, it's really high.
Okay, that's true. I keep thinking you're looking at this. So there was a permit, a proposal for, actually it was Hart's Mountain, to build a big office building there. And so in making the decision, should we grant this permit, the Division of Coastal Resources went back to the legislative findings, right? Legislative findings, remember how I said that those are important? Went back to the legislative findings and said, it looks like what the legislature was aiming at here is that coastal resources is a broad term. It's not just the fish, it's not just the water, it's the sense of the coast. And because the Hudson River here is tidal, it is covered, it's regulated by the Coastal Zone Management Act and various coastal laws here in New Jersey. And so the decision was, this skyline view is unique nationally, it's a coastal resource, we will not grant the permit. So so in this case, the interpretation of the policy was made by a bureaucrat sitting in his office about a particular permit. So it wasn't even a law, it wasn't a regulation, it wasn't an executive order, it was a particular permit. And in that way, even the implementation of the law in a particular permit is an opportunity to reflect policy. Because all of a sudden, the policy is that scenic vistas would be defined as a coastal resource. He was overturned by his boss, who ended up signing the permit, but the case is like fascinating. One last example is the New Jersey Air Pollution Control Act, which is the state counterpart to the Federal Clean Air Act, was passed in New Jersey in 1954. So it was one of the first real kind of environmental laws in the state of New Jersey. So back in 1954, they weren't thinking so much about climate change regulation at the state level. So in 2002, 3, 4 maybe, when the state of New Jersey really wanted to start to become aggressive on how it was regulating climate change, it went to the legislature to start to get new authority to work on climate change. But the legislative process can take time. So in addition to doing that, the state looked at the State Air Pollution Control Act, the 1954 Air Pollution Control Act. So from 1954 to 2004, that's a long time, right? So it took, 30 years, 40 years, to come to that place where they interpreted, the state looked at the legislative findings and said, we believe that the legislature left room in this law for us to interpret new science and new pollutants. And so the state issued a regulation that actually does still stand today. So the state issued a regulation, the State Department of Environmental Protection, so an executive agency that defined CO2 as an air pollutant under the authority of the Air Pollution Control Act, okay, without even having new climate authority. All right. So I remembered to talk to you about legislative findings. They're very important. They're very important because the other thing about legislative findings is when government gets sued and you're sitting in front of the judge, for the judge to decide whether a decision made by an executive agency meets the US Constitution, meets the state constitution, or meets a specific law, they look at the legislative findings. So they'll look and they'll say, did the legislative findings in the Air Pollution Control Act speak to the ability to include new science and new pollutants? I think it did, and I think that the state made the right decision to define CO2 as an air pollutant under the Air Pollution Control Act. So legislative findings, whenever you read them, they seem like blah, 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 but they're really important, and people spend a lot of time in rooms writing them because they know that they really, in and of themselves, make policy. Okay, so the content of the rules and regulations sets policy. I would argue that the process by which rules and regulations make policy is policy in and of itself. So part of that is every state has, this is real big excitement. I hope there's a cute picture coming. So every state has an Administrative Procedures Act that tells executive agencies how they have to proceed with creating rules and regulations. And it says things like this. It says when you issue a rule, you have to notice it in a certain document so people can find it. You have to allow for public comment. You have to have a minimum of whatever, 30, 60, 90 days for public comment. When you make your final decision, you issue your final rule, you have to explain how you addressed all the public comments. So the Administrative Procedures Act is important. And in and of itself, it sets policy because it says how are you going to go about creating this rule and who are you going to have at the table and who you're going to not have at the table. And then the other thing that's important is thinking about what authority do you have to implement a new policy. So my example here, which also goes back to the 1954 New Jersey Air Pollution Control Act, is, and this is an example, so this is the positive, inspirational example of good process. So through an executive order at the state level, the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection established a task force to look at sources of mercury in the environment. So, where is mercury coming from? We think we should be concerned about it. Where's it coming from? What kind of health impacts can we expect from that? What are the opportunities to address it? And so the task force came together and deliberated, and lots of Rutgers scientists were involved in this task force. And it's hard to see this chart on the right, but what they did, among lots of other things, was they identified the major sources of mercury emissions and fate and transport of mercury and areas where people were mostly being exposed in the state of New Jersey. So it was a very comprehensive report. And as a result, the way that the executive branch proceeded with its rulemaking was it used this report as its basis and background for its policymaking. So at first it said, well, the major source is from coal plants. And so using the authority of the Air Pollution Control Act, the state issued very stringent regulations on coal plants in terms of mercury emissions. Next, it said the next source, if we go down the list, is municipal solid waste incinerators. So now, using the Air Pollution Control Act, we're going to address emissions and regulate emissions from municipal solid waste. And then it was the sludge that was coming out of those facilities because the facilities were just taking it from the air and sticking it in the sludge. And then it eventually, so it was hitting all the big sources. And then it started to look at those little switches in your car that let you turn your lights on. And so there was a new law in New Jersey. So the legislators looked at this one and they said this might be a rough one for the executive agency to implement because, the auto scrap people are going to go after them for this, and it might be hard to interpret as being tied to the Air Pollution Control Act. So there's in this case, the legislature took it upon themselves to create a new law that says that when you scrap your car, the scrapper has to take out the little mercury switch that that turns your lights, regulates your lights in your car. And then finally, I think it was under the Clean Water Act, the Water Pollution Control Act in New Jersey, then the executive agency passed a law that says that, this was really popular, that said that dentists have to have traps in their little sinks when you spit. that collects your dental amalgam because those have mercury in them. And that was actually, if you could see this chart, you'll see that it was, again, as they ticked down the list, they said, okay, here's dental amalgam. Now it's time to get to dental amalgam. We did municipal solid waste. We did auto switches. We did coal plants. You know, now let's get down to the dental amalgam. And you can only imagine how excited the dentists were about that. But in that case, they set policy, in that case using the Water Pollution Control Act, not a new law, and the process they followed was one that was highly participatory, highly informed by the science community, extremely systematic. This source first, that source next. So that's an example of how the thinking goes in terms of developing rules and regs, which is a really good story, a happy story. So now let's talk about other ways in terms regs, laws are implemented. So in 2006 maybe, the New Jersey legislature passed the Coastal and Ocean Protection Council Act. And what this act did, it was very quiet, it kind of just slid through the legislature. So what the act did was it defines the term ecosystem-based management. And, you know, which is kind of big thinking about how systems are integrated. And then it created a council. And the council was to advise the government and the governor and the legislature on what should we be doing, what policies should we have in place in New Jersey to really promote ecosystem-based management. And then it said the council should listen to stakeholders, listen to potential conflicts from stakeholders, how do we do this, and then report to the legislature. So in a lot of ways, it was creating the framework for the concept of ecosystem-based management to become the policy of the land, right? So very important law. Sounds like very simple, create a council, ecosystem-based management. But where it goes, and I'll give you one example in a minute of something that seems small but became big. So this is a council that could really create, make recommendations on policy, listens to stakeholders, create the buzz, and lay out a framework for a very different way of managing coastal resources in New Jersey. Except the governor's office never created the council, and the legislature never appropriated the big whopping $75,000 that was intended to support the creation of the council, and the council still has not been convened today. So that's just another example, right? So in this case, this was kind of like the policy of the legislature saying, we want to really understand this ecosystem-based management thing, and it just never moved forward because of lack of implementation. So, you know, here's another example of interpretation. And in this case, we have Scott Pruitt, who's advancing new rulemaking in terms of transparency. Have you guys followed this? Right? Everyone's good? Everyone understands this? Okay, so the idea that any science that can be used to inform decision-making at EPA has to come from sources that can be made publicly available. So if you go and you get input through community surveys from people, you have to disclose who did your survey. You have to disclose everything. And it's just not how science is done, right? All your data, all the data that you've ever collected for your research study has to be disclosed. So, which essentially translates into this means that nothing will move forward, nothing will be done. But by doing that, and he's using the Federal Administrative Procedures Act, and to essentially stall the integration of science into decision making, right? So that's another interpretation. Oh, okay, so here's John Corzine signing the New Jersey Global Warming Response Act. And among other things, the Global Warming Response Act, 2004, sets 2020 and 2050 limits for the state in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And it requires the state to do a big plan for how it's going to achieve the emissions. But the other thing that it does is it requires the State Department of Environmental Protection to require sources, point sources of greenhouse gas emissions to file a report saying, here's what I emit. So if you're a coal-fired power plant, or if you're a company that runs natural gas lines and you have used methane, or if you are a refrigerated warehouse and you're using SF6 or other highly warming gases, you have to file a report and say, this is what I use, this is how much I use it. Now, for those of us who could talk about this stuff all day, and I promise I won't, but reporting's important, right? Because what gets measured gets managed, right? So if you can understand what the sources of emissions are, then you can start to think about the policy that goes with it. And so just like with mercury, because the data was collected and the scientists could identify what are all the different sources of mercury, they could start to tick through the list of municipal solid waste incinerators, then let's go to dental amalgam, let's go to auto switches. So that sounds pretty darn logical, like let's have a reporting rule so we know where sources are. Except that in the waning days, the last couple days of the Karzai administration, the rule to implement the reporting program, which had been proposed, stakeholder process, lots of stakeholders, lots of input, was not adopted. And so for reasons that we could talk about some other time. And so as a result, there is no reporting rule in New Jersey, even though the law says there shall be a reporting rule. Okay, cue time. Everyone's good? You all cued it out? Okay. So, all right, so now let's talk about municipal policy a little bit. And this is where I'm really on shaky ground. So, yes.
Maybe before we go into that.
Thank you.
I think something that at least we talked about a bunch of last week in our policy classes is this assumption that when we were kids we learned, oh, a bill gets passed because someone somewhere just brings it to their local legislator and then they listen and propose it and then it gets passed. So maybe you could talk for a second about something like the Mercury Task Force, since that's an executive order.
Yeah.
That idea came from someone.
Yeah.
And how did that happen if it's not?
Yeah, in the case of the Mercury Task Force, it came because there was sampling of fish, and the levels of mercury in fish in New Jersey were super high. Super high. And the risk assessments that were done by the science community here at Rutgers pointed to advisories that were do not eat. Like, don't eat this fish ever. No, not just even if you're pregnant, don't eat the fish. You can't eat the fish. So the question became, where the heck is this coming from? And so it really kind of came, in that case, it came from a public health perspective. In the case of things like the Global Warming Response Act, that really came from the advocacy community. And I think the legislature probably didn't think, oh, we're going to set a 2050 goal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is no one's going to be upset about this. No one disagreed with it. But when the agency issued its reporting rule that said you have to file a report and disclose what you use, that's kind of when the you-know-what hit the fan. Okay. All right. So municipalities are a subsidiary of the state. And there's two ways in different states as to how municipalities kind of are authorized, I suppose. The first is that a municipality is a creature of the state, and it has to follow state directives, versus the municipality is essentially a small kingdom in itself, I guess, and it has full control over the decision-making that is done. So where do you think New Jersey falls, for those of you who know New Jersey? Any ideas? B? Wrong. So the way it works in New Jersey, which I answered B when this first got presented to me. So the way it works in New Jersey is that our towns and municipalities are really creatures of the state unless specifically authorized by a law from the state legislature that says that they can make decisions on their own. So we think about New Jersey as a home rule state because there is a specific law that authorizes municipalities to make decisions about land use, and that's the municipal land use law. But unless there's a specific authorizing piece of legislation that says municipalities can do X, Y, and Z, then it's in the jurisdiction of the state. So, so there we go. So land use. So how does it play out? So what if a municipality wants to raise property taxes? Can they do that? Yes, because there is a law that authorizes them to do that. Can they create a green building code, a stretch code that goes beyond the state building code? Yes, they can, because the state building code law allows them to do that. How about a plastic ban tax, ban or tax? I don't know the answer to this question, and I didn't have time to look at. There are 3 towns in the state of New Jersey that have implemented, it's that if you ask for a bag, you pay 10 cents kind of laws. So it's not really a ban. Do you know the answer?
Well, I'm just trying to sit here thinking there are towns that have banned other things. Like there are still a couple dry towns like in New Jersey, so if they can ban alcohol, maybe they can ban plastic bags.
No, because there's a law that allows them to control alcohol beverages, which is why everyone's waiting to see what kind of law will allow them to control recreational marijuana. A municipality couldn't just do that now, right? So what we have in 3 towns in New Jersey is, I guess it's a tax, right? Because if you don't bring your own bag and you ask them for a bag, then they can charge you 10 cents. And what I don't know, because I started to try to research and it was so convoluted, it was crazy. What I don't know is if those towns got sued, whether they would win or lose. Because whether taxation is something that is controlled by the state, with the exception of property taxes, which is why a state can raise, a municipality can raise property taxes, because property taxes are governed by the municipality. Right now, there is a big push in New Jersey to have a state law that allows for plastic bag bans. And so questions that policymakers and legislators are probably think is that, would you define that law? Would you structure that law to say a municipality can opt out or opt in? Or is it that the state says, we're imposing a state tax on plastic bags, and so that the income from that tax comes to the state as opposed to the municipality? So those are the things that are being debated in the legislature now, and there's back and forth as to whether this governor is going to support anything. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd be really curious to find out. So in New Jersey, what about this concept of whether a town just like Philadelphia did in terms of having a tax on sugary sweet drinks, right? Because there's been a real documentation of that tax leading to reduced consumption of sodas and increased consumption in water. So could we do that? No. Because taxation is governed by the state except for property taxes. So great idea, but you want to run for your local borough council or town council and say, I'm running on the sugary sweet tax thing? You're not going to get anywhere.
Why can they do that with sugary sweet drinks and not alcoholic beverages?
Put a tax on?
Yeah, because with alcoholic beverages, the local municipalities can regulate it, but with sugary drinks.
But locally, because there's a law that says they can do alcohol, and with alcohol, what it is they're allowed to sell permits.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and so relevant to your world, what about, could a town use its existing authority to implement a coastal resilience plan? Well, but how? What policy? But implementing the plan. So there are these arcane things in state laws in New Jersey, like joint ventures and joint meetings that create ways for towns to talk to each other and for towns to establish sewer authorities and things like that. And there are ways that towns can look at their own liability in terms of municipal assets. They're including public housing. do those authorities, can a town dip into those authorities that were meant for totally different reasons? They were meant to like provide housing for people, right? Or they're meant to create sewer authorities. Can those authorities be tapped to implement a coastal resilience plan? And the answer to the question is, I don't know, but I have a really good proposal out there that I'm hoping someone funds to actually bring in some people, some really smart people from the Blaustein School who understand how municipal policy works. And to think about municipal policy that has nothing to do with resilience, nothing to even do with the environment, and think differently and think, could we take that municipal authority and apply it for the purposes of resilience planning? So that's kind of how like policymakers think. Okay, so what am I, okay, so one of the important things to keep in mind is there's tremendous value about consistency in policy. And so sometimes what a state or a federal government will consider is what happens if we have, so say New Jersey did allow towns to impose a sugary drink tax. So what if we had 565 different sugary drink taxes, right? I mean, that's just nuts, right, in terms of implementation. And it's confusing and it's probably not even effective because at that point, people, I don't know if they'll just drink soda like crazy or they'll just not drink, maybe they'll just drink alcohol then, right? They'll say, forget the soda, we'll just drink alcohol. So there's value in having consistency. And so that's something that's always taken into consideration is this a policy that's better presented at a state level or at a federal level rather than 565 individual municipalities. Another thing that policymakers often think about is the winner and loser thing, right? So we talked to you in class about winners and losers. And so here's a different way to think about winners and losers. So there are always regulated entities. There's always businesses who are ahead of the curve, right? So they were thinking about sustainability before anyone even came up with that word. And so, they're thinking about how to make a dish detergent that, really doesn't affect water quality. And then for them, they want to see a level playing field. So they're doing this because they think they've got a business model where they can make some money. But they kind of feel like, everyone else shouldn't be allowed to slide and, be polluting waterways. So to them, there's definitely some advantage to having the policy, the curve, keep up with their innovation. And that's something that's often kind of said in policy discussions is the ability to sort of reward those front leaders. All right, so this is the kind of stuff policymakers think about. Oh, I did that twice. All right, so another category of how policy is made is by case law, right? Is by people suing each other. And so government gets sued when a party thinks that a decision, whether that's a particular project decision like the Helix decision, or a rule doesn't meet the standards of a law or the Constitution. Lawsuits also happen when the legislative body, so the New Jersey legislature or Congress, attempts to implement a law that the person doing the suing thinks doesn't meet the Constitution, right? So in that way, there's a lot of interpretation, and we look to the courts to help us better understand and interpret the laws. So in 91, Governor Jim Florio signed the New Jersey Pollution Prevention Law. So the New Jersey Pollution Prevention Law is really kind of innovative. And it was based on the premise that if we take industrial and commercial facilities that use and discharge hazardous materials, and we ask them to look to see how they could reduce the use of chemicals, they'll want to logically reduce the use of chemicals because handling chemicals in your industrial facility is quite frankly expensive, right? You got to pay for permits, you got to pay for inspections, you got to pay for treatment, right? So the idea was mandatory planning, voluntary implementation, because if they do a plan, then voila, they'll see the light and they'll want to implement the plan. So this law went through the legislature, lots of stakeholder input, tons hearings, stakeholder meetings, behind the closed door meetings, lots of everyone loved it. It's like so mom and apple pie, it's incredible. And then the agency implemented the law and got sued by the Chemical Industry Council who participated in the stakeholder process, who said this violates the law. It's like, how does it violate the law? And what the Chemical Industry Council said was that the law allows for voluntary implementation, voluntary conformance with the law. And so the state said, no. It says the facility shall develop a plan and may implement it. And that went to the state Supreme Court. I mean, so, and in that case, the state was backed up by the courts unanimously. That was a happy day. And so that's the policy. So it implements the policy. It affirms the policy. So I have pictures, I'm sorry. So there's the New Jersey pollution prevention law. So the other thing that the New Jersey pollution prevention law does is it implements the waste management hierarchy. So this is, we bureaucrats, we're so fun. So do you guys know what the waste management hierarchy is? All right. So it's important, right, because what the waste management hierarchy does is it says the most important thing to do is to not use chemicals if we can avoid it, right? These are things that are visionary. You know, today's generations talk a lot about sustainability, but this in 1991, the legislature was like way ahead. It's better to not use the chemicals to begin with, source reduction. And then from there, it's better to reuse if you have to use it, to recycle, and then recover and then dispose of. So that was important because there's a lot of language in the legislative findings on that law that echoes this waste management hierarchy, which could be used in interpretation of other policy. So it means the idea, you know, if the state wanted to interpret that to say, let's get a bunch of people together to talk about whether we can find ways to require industry to not use a certain chemical, you could probably tap that law and use that. Okay, so the New Jersey Highlands Law, you guys all met Dan Van Abs, who helped with, once the Highlands Law was passed. During the development of the Highlands Law, the law establishes two zones in the New Jersey Highlands. One is the planning area and one is the preservation area. And the preservation area does not mean that the land is preserved. What it means is there's very, very stringent environmental restrictions for development in that area in terms of things like septic density. And so the executive agency that passed those laws was sued by the New Jersey developers, saying that that preservation area and those limits, those environmental limits were so restrictive that it was a taking. All right, so a taking meaning that the land could not be fairly developed. And the courts ruled that because the law has a provision that says lands can be assessed before the law and after the law, and if the state's going to buy property, it has to take whichever price is better, that it wasn't a takings. That was a pretty big darn finding because it allowed the law to stand, and it was a very controversial law. Someday, when you really want to hear a good bedtime story, we can talk about affordable housing in New Jersey. But the short of it is there is a Fair Housing Act, Federal Fair Housing Act, and there's Lyndon Johnson signing it. And the Federal Fair Housing Act, besides lots of other things, it says everyone in this country deserves to have a home. And implements programs to allow that. And that's regardless of how much money you make or what color you are or whether you have a disability, you deserve a home. And so New Jersey has a similar law. And so, and if you ever really want to read the history on it, I'm giving you a link there. So in New Jersey, the New Jersey Fair Housing Act didn't really get implemented a lot. And so there was a lawsuit called the Mount Laurel Decision from Mount Laurel, New Jersey, which stipulated that where the folks suing who were promoting the ability to have a lower income African-American community have access opportunities, that they weren't getting sufficient housing, that they needed to have housing, that there needed to be zoning in the town that allowed for that kind of lower income housing. And they won. And so as a result, the state was required to implement rules to tell towns how to go about meeting their Mount Laurel obligations. So after years and years and years of this, in the end, under previous administrations, each town kind of had an obligation, a number that it had to meet in terms of providing fair housing in their town and to zone to make sure that kind of housing is available. Under the Christie administration, chose to not even have the board that oversees fair housing meet. And so they didn't issue the obligations to the towns. Now, it's a very long story. The bottom line, though, is what the courts did in this case was because they thought the executive agency, the Department of Community Affairs, was so recalcitrant, so dragging its feet on implementing this law. The court got fed up after lots and many years, like telling the state to do something. And so instead what they did was the court said, we're gonna take it over. We're not even gonna let you guys implement anymore. We're doing it. And so what the court did was it contracted with a nonprofit organization, in fact, the nonprofit organization that had sued the state, the Fair Share Housing Center, and it told towns that they had to negotiate with the nonprofit group on their obligation. So my town settled in September with the Fair Share Housing Center on our obligation for our number. Didn't have the court there, didn't even have the state there. So it's this kind of crazy mix where in this case, the court was very active and clearly set policy that said that, no, you towns have to meet your obligation and we're gonna tell you what it is. Okay, so the last example in terms of case law is, for some reason, I chose to spend 18 years on my local school board. So you know, it's a nice little school, it's a happy school. So one day we're at the school board meeting and the principal says to us that the talent show was that coming Friday and that a little girl was gonna sing a song called My Mighty God, or My God is a Mighty God, My God's a Mighty God. And the principal was a little uncomfortable because it wasn't Michael Row the Boat Ashore. It was My God is a Mighty God, and I'm not so sure about yours. And she was a little nervous, like, And so we said, okay, let's ask our lawyer, like, what, you know, are we okay in this ground? And the answer was, yeah, it's kind of a gray area, but you're okay. He looked at the case law, you're okay. So the next day we got sued by the family, who then hired an advocacy law firm and who asked for a restraining order to stop the talent show. We won on that, but then went to proceed to court. And what the judge decided, you know, we were all studying First Amendment rights and like, oh, you know, we're doing the right thing. We don't want to exclude anyone. And what the judge decided was not so much about the First Amendment, but even though the talent show was in the school building that is supported by taxpayers, was supervised by a teacher who was paid by tax dollars, that because the kids got to pick their own piece of music, it was self-expression, and that any kid could pick whatever they wanted. Regardless, you know, of how inflammatory it was. So that immediately changed, in this case, a little teeny tiny school board's policy, so that the next year, when the elementary school kids would typically walk into town and paint windows for Halloween in the business district, we told them what they had to paint. Because we had this full expectation that we were going to then have like a lot of Satan stuff as a backlash to the Almighty God. So we changed in a very small way, we changed our policy. And when the PTA wanted to have a student-generated school newspaper, we had to think about it too. Because that was, again, where students were going to pick their own material. So policy we see every day. Okay, so referendum, I don't know a lot about it, but there are some states, mostly in the West, because it came out of the progressive era, which was a real kind of Midwest sort of thing, where, and so what referendum involves is initiative, referendum, and recall. So where you as a citizen can, there's a different number of petitioners you have. You file a petition. I think everybody in the state of hoo-ha should wear pink shorts every Tuesday. And if you get the certain number of petitions you want there, it gets on the ballot, right? Or I think we should recall, Congressman so-and-so or state legislator so-and-so, and you get the petitions, it gets on the ballot. I've never lived in a state with it, but it's pretty fascinating. And so there, so that's referendum. All right, cuteness, okay, all right. All right, so my sort of final kind of tidbits are, in policymaking, words are important. And so some examples are, there are people like me that sit around for hours and we talk about things like, is it and or is it or? And does the law say that when we're reporting greenhouse gases, they have to report the quantity of the gas or the volume of the gas? Or is it and the volume of the gas? So which is it? We have to debate the and versus the or. We also love including but not limited to, right? So when the policy says you have to do X, Y, and Z, and it includes those, but it's not limited to those, so that the implementing agency can say, oh, and D, E, and F, thank you very much. Including but not limited to is popular. Oh, and then the may versus shall. You gotta love the may versus shall, right? So you may require an industrial facility to report their chemical use, or you shall require a company to report their chemical use, which of course then makes you all think like we should just get a life and why the heck are we sitting around thinking about these kinds of things? But it's important because those words create important policy. Okay, so process matters. So it's not just who's sitting at the table, and this is actually an Elizabeth Dole quote, that the best public policy is made when you're listening to the people who are going to be impacted, and hopefully this is at least one lesson that you got out of our class, that process matters and that there are winners and losers in policymaking, and making sure that both have a seat at the table is important. But then process also matters in terms of the process by which the policy is made. So when the state of New Jersey decided to pull out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative under the Christie administration, at first the Christie administration just sort of issued a press release, we're pulling out. And then they got sued by the environmental groups, and the court said, no, you joined it by writing a rule. You need to write a rule to get out of it because the public has the opportunity to comment. So how it's done, not just what it's done, but how it's done is important. So I'm hoping that one lesson that you get out of this is who's in charge matters, because policy is often about interpretation. And this is my one little tie to civics, right? Which is that we live in a democratic society, who you vote for gets into office and they get to interpret policy. So who's in charge really does matter. I'm not telling you how to vote, I'm just saying voting really does make a difference. So it's fun for people who don't work on policy to sit around and talk about how stupid policy is, right? And they can find like arcane language and say, this is so stupid. But I would argue that pretty much everything's there for a reason. And it came from something. And I was reminded of this last week because I was on a panel that was talking about how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this region, in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region. And one person on the panel was a representative from Tesla. And I've heard this before, right? And so, the facilitator said to all of us, if you could wave a magic wand, what's the one thing that you would do? And so what she said is she would eliminate the requirement in New Jersey. I don't know what law it's under, but there's a requirement in Jersey that cars have to be sold by car dealers, right? And I have a friend, a very old friend, who runs the Association of Car Dealers, and sometimes you see him on commercials talking about why they disagree with Tesla. What I don't understand is there's some reason why New Jersey's got a law that says that cars have to be sold by car dealers. Tesla doesn't like it because when you buy a Tesla, I guess you go online, you order the Tesla, and it shows up the next day or something. You don't go to the car dealer. I don't know why that provision's there. Is it because when people first started selling cars that people were getting run over by cars, or they were unsafe and they were blowing up back in, like, I don't know, 1940 or whenever that law was passed? I have no idea, but there's some reason. Maybe it's a dumb reason. Maybe it's because some legislator, was a car dealer. But there's some reason. And so when she said this on the panel, I almost mouthed off and said, yeah, but we should find out why that policy's there in the first place, but I decided to just keep my mouth shut. So when you're about to diss some wacky, crazy policy, just keep in mind that there's some reason it's there, and effective policymaking lets you think about why it's there, because maybe there's a good reason for it, and you need to at least think about that when you're doing your policy that might eliminate it. Okay, so the concept that small things become big. So all those ands and ors and shalls and including but not ofs are important because policymakers can make a decision and it can really reverberate and have a very long life. So your handout number 5 is, for any executive agency, they have general powers. So when the agency is created, there's a law. So this is the example of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So there's a law that says the legislature's creating the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and it's got these kind of general authorities. And so this is a list of some of their general authorities. Now, it's not intended to do everything, right? Because there's lots of other laws. There's air laws, water laws, pollution prevention laws, climate laws. But in this case, it offers general direction for what the purpose of that agency is. And under J, it says that this agency will administer or supervise programs of industrial planning for environmental protection. So using just that authority alone, the State Department of Environmental Protection did this thing back in 1977, I think, where no other authority, just under the general powers of the department, they issued a regulation and they said, industrial facilities are going to fill out this form that tell us what chemicals do they bring into their facility, what chemicals do they keep on site at the facility, what chemical do they put out of their facility, and where do they put those chemicals? Where do they get rid of those chemicals? Now, this was before Superfund. This was before many environmental laws. And so when industrial facilities in New Jersey got this, they said, oh, we're supposed to tell the state what we do with our chemicals, and they filled it out and sent it in. So as a result, the Industrial Survey Project led to this unbelievable database of where chemicals were coming from and where chemicals went. And as a result, when people analyzed it, when state employees analyzed it, they said, holy crap, Agent Orange being made in Newark? Let's go test some of the sediment and the waters up there, and oh my God, there's dioxin. So a lot of those investigations in terms of contamination came from the Industrial Survey because it gave the state investigators the opportunities to start to think, where could the contaminants that we're seeing in the environment have come from? And they were able to trace it back, and they were able to use it in court to identify responsible parties, because it was the parties themselves who actually self-reported where they were disposing of their chemicals. And that was all just with the general powers of the department. So even the general powers of the department provided a policy option. What's also neat is that this law then led to a legislated, so it was so successful that it encouraged the legislature to pass the 1983 Workroom Community Right to Know Act in New Jersey, which runs a more structured program of requiring that kind of reporting, which led to the Federal Toxics Release Inventory. So all of that, the Federal Toxics Release Inventory, grew out of the New Jersey law, which grew out of the survey, which grew out of the general powers of the department. So a very little thing became a very, very big thing. So sometimes policy making is really fast. So my story on this comes from my boyfriend, which was a story about years and years, probably decades ago. So in New Jersey, for utilities, you pass your costs along to the ratepayers, right? To all of us who pay our electric bills or our water bills. And so there was one utility that had, redone their offices, very nice, and so they, had a big open house, invited legislators in, invited the community, come see our new facility. And so one legislator, went and was so incensed that they had these lovely, beautiful antiques in their office that the next day he dropped a piece of legislation that said you can't put antiques in the rate base. Now, the bill didn't go anywhere, but if it did, we would have a policy in the state of New Jersey that says you can't put antiques in the rate base and pass it along to the ratepayers. But, sometimes it's fast. That was fast. That was 24 hours. And that could have been the policy in the state of New Jersey. Sometimes policy is unbelievably slow, right? So in 1992, the U.S. Forest Service did a study of the Highlands, right? We've talked about the Highlands region a lot and looked at it in terms of its unique characters, its unique, incredible value to the state of New Jersey, but also its importance as a source of clean drinking water for New Jerseyans all over the state. So that was a very analytical study, and there was probably another 40 years of research prior leading up to the Forest Service study in 92. In 96, the Regional Plan Association, which is a planning group that looks at sustainable planning for northern New Jersey, southern Connecticut, and New York City, looked at the Highlands and they thought about the overall metropolitan region, and they said this is a really important area for drinking water, but also for recreation, for open space. We really should be looking for ways to help protect this important resource because it's good for the entire metropolitan region, including those people living in Brooklyn. In 2002, Professor Rick Lathrop updated the Forest Study Report in a very kind of visionary way with limited resources, did an amazing job, which really drew some attention of decision makers. And so, which led to Governor at the time, Jim McGreevey, to create a task force. So similar to the Mercury Task Force, he convened a task force of lots of different interests, builders, developers, people who, hug trees, people who look at birds, people who drink water, who came together and who made recommendations in terms of how the Highlands could be protected, which led to the 2004 New Jersey Highlands Protection Act that was sponsored by Senator Smith. So, that's a fairly, in some ways, that's a compressed period of time, and you can think about the Mercury timeline too. But, even if we just start in 92 with the Forest Service study, again, there's probably decades of work prior to the Forest Service study. But starting with the Forest Service study, you can see how long it takes to get to meaningful policy. This is also a case where there was very specific science and a participatory process that informed that decision. And you could say that it was another mom and apple pie thing, although the day after the Highlands Law passed and the legislature dropped this other anti-environmental bill that was just made the Highlands, seem like, there was a crazy kind of sort of one-shot deal, and all of a sudden now we're back to like policy as it normally is in terms of protecting the environment. So I guess in closing, for those of you who are not policy wonks, but who are really scientists, I encourage you to embrace policy and not be intimidated by policy, to understand that your research and your science will be more impactful if you at least leave yourself open to appreciating that you've got a role to play in the policy process as evidenced by the Highlands and the Mercury examples. We all live with policy every day. So in my house, I'm a single mom, right? And I got 2 kids, although they're not at home these days. But the policy was always, okay, you don't have to get an A, but you got to do your homework, you got to get it in on time. And if there's an optional exercise as part of your homework, you got to do the optional exercise. That's policy number 1. Policy number 2 is, now you're guys going to think I'm really obsessive. So policy number 2 is everyone is allowed to have a pair of sneakers in the public space because that encourages physical activity, but that's it. And the rest of the shoes go in your closet. That's the policy. Policy number 3, when you're a teenager and you get your working papers and you start to work, one paycheck goes to you to have fun and go to Sephora and get your nails done. One paycheck comes to mom, and that goes into your college account. Now, difference from the other policies I talked about, in these cases, there's no authority except the mom authority, the implicit authority. There's absolutely no process involved. It's just applied, and there's certainly no appeal. So you all have a real orientation for policy already, because at some point, you lived in a home with other people, and whether that was your parents or someone else. So thank you. I hope this was helpful, and here is your last suite of cute pictures. So how was that? Was that what you wanted? Okay. All right. Elena, how'd I do? Was it helpful? Yes. Okay. All right. All right. Questions? Anything? And we'll let Zoe answer, and Holly. No? That was it? That was like so good? All right. Carrie, do you have any?
No, if anyone, if we have no questions, thanks again.
All right. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.